Are you serious? You can't be serious, George Luckett hissed when Reynolds told him he had just been handed a summons. I'm afraid so, buddy, said the large man with a sympathetic expression on his face, taking a digital photo of George holding the large, brown envelope. George stood on the small porch of his house and watched the statue-like officer descend the steps, wheezing and groaning. He looked back at the front door of his house, the keys still in his hand. But I, George whispered. And what, sir? There's a restraining order. You need to call the police so they can come and get your things, Reynolds advised as he left. Damn it, Samantha, right? What happened? George shouted through the door. Sir, you have been served with a restraining order, Reynolds said, opening the door of his large 39-year-old Cadillac convertible. Don't make this worse, okay? George shook his head in confusion. As far as he knew, he and Samantha were happy. She had definitely rocked his world the night before he left for another 14-day shift offshore. He decided that 14 days was enough time for someone to decide to end a marriage and file for divorce, but he couldn't remember doing or saying anything that would have prompted his wife to file for an annulment. George decided to call his wife's cousin, Polly Chastain. But after reviewing the divorce papers, George was convinced that it was Polly who had prepared and filed them. Sir? Asked the policeman with a stony face, tapping on the window of George's truck. Sir, you have a restraining order. Wow, that was fast, George muttered. I just called, and you're already here? No. I got a call saying you were in violation of a restraining order, Brian Josh said. What? So you're not here to help me get my things? Brian called the station and said he was there to help George Lackett collect his personal belongings from his home. George waited patiently while the police officer reported the situation to the station. You really didn't call, did you? Brian grinned as he approached him. No, but since you're here, George replied. George showed good sense and kept quiet when Samantha let him and the police officer into the house. Smiling, Samantha pointed to several garbage bags and said she had already packed all of George's things. George nodded and asked Brian, not Samantha, if he could check again to make sure she had packed everything. Officer, I'm getting my gun out of the nightstand, George said as they stood in the bedroom. You don't have... Samantha smirked, but immediately fell silent when George pulled out his .44 caliber Smith & Wesson. And my rosary. My mother gave it to me when I took my first communion, George said, pulling the silver rosary out of Samantha's nightstand drawer. You gave them to me when we got married, Samantha objected. And now you don't want to be married? I'm taking them back, George explained. George also took 3 pillows from the bed. Then he took a large quilted blanket out of the closet in the hallway. My sister made it for me, George explained quietly to Brian. She was a damn moron, Samantha said mockingly to George. She called you sissy because she was so happy to finally have an older sister, George reminded her, wiping the smirk off Samantha's face. After trying to check into the DeGard Hotel, George discovered that Samantha was busy. His cards were blocked. A check of their joint account showed that there was $100 left. George smiled nervously at the clerk and took out his American Express card. The girl's hand trembled as she took it from him. George almost laughed when she exhaled. She didn't know about this card, George explained to the girl. I used it to buy her birthday and Christmas presents. Back in his room, George reread the documents. Samantha demanded $4,000 a month in alimony and full ownership of the house, while George had to continue paying the mortgage and all utilities. In return, she generously allowed George to keep all the money in their savings and checking accounts. George was genuinely puzzled. There had been no indication that Samantha was unhappy with him or their marriage. True, she called him stuck in his ways, but she had been calling him that for years. When they bought the house, Samantha wanted to run out and buy everything for him right away. Instead, George carefully planned every major purchase. He also doubled his monthly mortgage payments. It's called home equity, George explained to Samantha when she wanted to put money into a vacation account instead of a home equity account. But Hawaii, Samantha whined. We're still going there for our 10th anniversary, George assured her. It's only 3 years away, and we'll have 3 more years of money for both the vacation and the house. Hawaii was stunning. The photos of the Paradise Island simply couldn't convey the reality. And Samantha, his pale-skinned, red-haired beauty, looked gorgeous in her turquoise monokini. George enjoyed applying sunscreen to her beautiful body. He hoped Samantha had packed his 3 Hawaiian shirts when she had cleared his things from the closet. He doubted he would ever return to the Paradise Island, but he liked the loose, comfortable shirts. Sighing, George searched his cell phone for a good lawyer. Richards, Pellichet, and Jones, a pleasant voice answered. Hearing the name of the law firm, he realized the seriousness of the situation. George sighed and trembled. The pleasant voice repeated the name of the firm. "I need to consult a divorce lawyer," George muttered. "Yes, sir," replied Ethel Gerard in a quiet, soothing voice. Ethel took down some information and assured George that a lawyer would contact him within an hour. George thanked her and finished his Dr. Pepper. The thought that a beer vending machine could be very lucrative crossed George's mind again. "Trevor Williams," Trevor introduced himself when George picked up the phone. "I can meet you tomorrow morning. How about 9:30? Trevor pulled some strings and the judge ordered the money to be returned to the bank accounts. Samantha was shocked when Polly called her and threatened to call off the divorce if Samantha continued her antics. Samantha wondered how George had managed to find a lawyer. She had deliberately withdrawn all the money, leaving George with only enough to pay for a motel room for a few nights. She had blocked their credit cards before he left for 2 weeks of work at sea and had reissued them in her name. "It doesn't matter how he managed to find a lawyer. He found one," Polly replied sharply. "Cousin or not, I'm not going to put up with this nonsense. Do you understand?" Grumbling, Samantha returned 50% of the money to their checking and savings accounts. She also handed over 4 of the 8 CDs she had taken from the safe. "What about the house, the mortgage?" Samantha asked. "He'll pay half until the judge decides on the division of property," Polly replied. "What about the electricity?" Samantha asked. "He doesn't live there, you do. Pay the bills." Polly sighed. "You know, despite what your friends told you, in a no-fault divorce, you don't automatically get the gold mine, and he doesn't get the mine. And Samantha, those allegations of abuse, you'd better prove them. The courts don't like being deceived or taken advantage of, you understand?" With the money from his new bank account, George rented a one-bedroom apartment in a relatively nice neighborhood in Kimball, Louisiana. A casual restaurant was within walking distance, and Cowboy's BBQ was a 3-minute drive away. The young couple renting the apartment next door were outgoing, loud, and friendly. He worked at Kendrick's Engineering, and she worked at Alana's Playtime in the delivery department. "Do you work with Bowman?" "You know, we do your updates and maintenance," Foster Chalmers said proudly. "Yes, sir," George smiled as he and Foster struggled to carry George's nearly new sofa up the stairs to his apartment. Denise Chalmers had somehow persuaded George to leave her the key to his mailbox and a spare key to his apartment. She checked his mail and left letters in his apartment. Their mailboxes were next to each other in a kiosk. She was offended when George asked how much it would cost. Foster offered 6 cans of St. Elizabeth lager, but Denise slapped her husband on the butt. "We're neighbors, right?" "Neighbors do that," Denise said with a thick Cajun accent. "Maybe this neighbor will buy you 6 cans of beer just because for fun?" George asked, seeing the disappointment on Foster's face. When George saw Samantha the next time, she had a noticeable belly. She was standing with an arrogant man in a very expensive suit. "When's the due date?" George asked Samantha. "We can file a petition," Trevor reminded Samantha with a stony face. "About 4 months," Samantha admitted. While the two lawyers talked to each other, George looked at his wife. She was a real beauty. Waist-length red hair, porcelain skin with freckles on her delicate nose. "And you can dance too," Samantha laughed cheerfully as they spun around to the lively music of the Zydeco band. Now, sitting in the courtroom of St. Elizabeth's Parish, George looked again at his beautiful red-haired wife. She radiated the happy glow that pregnant women usually have, and George smiled sadly. Since Samantha couldn't provide any evidence, the restraining order was lifted. Trevor grinned when George whispered that he had no desire to go within 500 yards of her. "Maybe, but it'll get you out of jail," Trevor reminded George. "So you can go grocery shopping without worrying that she'll show up in the next aisle and start yelling that you're violating the restraining order." "The police? I'm not inclined to believe you didn't know she was there." "What? Why do you need that?" Samantha shouted when George, through Trevor, demanded a paternity test. "She's not yours. Insurance. You can't say you have the best insurance through work, can you?" George asked. "But I'm already covered by your insurance," Samantha objected. "Oh no, ma'am, you're not insured," George laughed bitterly. "Before you could turn around, I already got the papers." "I'll add her and the baby to my insurance," William grinned. "Well, then you can kiss your alimony goodbye," Polly hissed, turning to Samantha. "What? Why?" Samantha asked. You and that genius just admitted that you were having an affair while you were married and living with Mr. Lackett. Polly sighed. In the future, keep your mouth shut and leave your boyfriend at home, okay? Before leaving for another 14-day shift, George took his blood test to Dr. Frank Roberts. He smiled and assured George that the DNA test could be done while the baby was still in the womb. The baby would not be harmed in any way. The sample would be taken from the amniotic fluid, not from the baby. Dr. Roberts told Trevor and Polly about George's concerns. Samantha's eyes filled with tears when Polly relayed the information to her. You know, maybe it's not too late, Polly said quietly to her cousin. Samantha just shook her head. She left her cousin's office and drove to Mooton Park. Samantha sat on a swing and rocked slowly until the heat forced her back into her air-conditioned car. Bowman Engineering was insured by Young Insurance. Tricarter, where William worked, was insured by Mutual Fidelity Insurance Group. Dr. Roger Pyler accepted Young Insurance medical insurance, but did not accept Mutual Fidelity. Dr. Ellen Sweetman accepted Mutual Fidelity Insurance, but Samantha had been seeing Dr. Pyler since she married George and was covered by his insurance. During her only visit to Dr. Ellen Sweetman, Samantha disliked the assembly line on her approach of the doctor and her staff. She gave me this beautiful ass, William said crudely. Oh my God, shut up, Polly shouted at the man. God, William? Seriously? Samantha exclaimed, completely embarrassed. George smelled alcohol. He was sure the smell wasn't coming from him, his lawyer, Samantha, or her lawyer. Really? Well, she always said I was too big, George said quietly. But congratulations, I'm sure it's fantastic. Shut up, Trevor hissed, trying to hide his amusement. George grinned as he watched William blush, and the two paralegals and the reporter couldn't hide their giggles. William glared at Polly, who ordered him to leave the conference room. After the documents were signed and notarized, Trevor and George went to the restroom. George was sure he had caught some kind of infection during his shift at the beach. He had diarrhea. Trevor spoke through the closed door of the stall and wished his client well before leaving. Yeah. I have 3 days to flush it out of my system, George muttered. As he left the restroom, George almost bumped into Samantha, who was coming out of the women's restroom. George apologized and let Samantha walk him to the glass doors of the office building. As he got into his pickup truck, George saw Samantha looking back. His first impulse was to shrug and drive away. She had filed for divorce and kicked him out of his own home. But his second instinct took over, and he rolled down the window of his pickup truck. Problem? William, we parked right here, Samantha stammered, pointing to an empty parking space. Where are you going? George asked, taking his cell phone out of the glove compartment. Home, I guess, Samantha admitted. Okay, fine. How about this? Uber is on its way, George said, looking at his phone screen. You don't have to do that, Samantha stammered, embarrassed. Samantha, you two don't know each other at all? I couldn't just drive away and leave you here. But you're not a stranger. You're the mother of my child, George said gently. Hey, how about this? I'll order dinner, and when you need a ride, I'll get a notification, said the smiling young man, who pulled up in a fairly new BMW. Are you George? I'm George. That's what I told her. You're already on your way, said George. Thanks. Have a good day. Samantha's eyes filled with tears again as she watched George's truck pull out of the parking lot. She got into the back seat of the Uber driver's car and waited while Polly's paralegal took several bags out of Cowboy's BBQ. Dude, now I'm really hungry after smelling that food, the young man laughed. I'll take you. Oh, hey, there are some nice houses in that neighborhood. Yes, there are, Samantha agreed quietly. Denise sent Foster to George's apartment with a large bowl of her chicken noodle soup. George and Foster grinned at Denise's insistent claims that chicken noodle soup would cure everything George had, but George ate the delicious soup anyway. After washing and drying the bowl, George filled it to the brim with Reese's Pieces. Denise blurted out that they were her favorite candy. Foster and George laughed at Denise's squeal, although she protested that she shouldn't do that she didn't need the extra calories, and that George knew how fattening those candies were. Denise happily ate a handful. While abroad, George used his bank's automatic payment feature to pay all his bills. For some reason, he smiled when he saw a bill from Dr. Roger Pyler among the bills. Hey, we're going to Vermilion, and you're coming too, Denise ordered when George entered the house. Okay, George smiled, realizing that arguing with his stubborn neighbor would get him nowhere. Shirley Furneaux is playing. You like her? Denise continued. She has a friend from work she wants you to meet, George Foster warned when Denise returned to the bedroom to finish getting ready. She's not from work, I just saw her at work, Denise corrected. Tammy Hale was a real estate agent with bright red hair and a vibrant personality. George liked her from the start, and it seemed like the feeling was mutual. They danced almost every dance, and when they stopped to have a beer, they chatted and laughed. But even though the evening was pleasant, both Tammy and George realized that there was no spark, no real chemistry between them. They parted ways, kissed each other on the cheek, and sincerely thanked each other for the fun time they had had. Denise won't leave, Foster said, and George smiled and shrugged. Listen, I work all the time, George said. It's hard for me to meet women on my own. See? Exclaimed Denise triumphantly. So just keep quiet. But Denise, no more redheads, okay? Said George, showing Denise a photo of Samantha on his cell phone. Oh, why didn't you say anything? Denise sighed, noticing that Samantha and Tammy could have been sisters. Because you didn't ask, Foster announced solemnly. You were going to sleep with her, Denise declared. And now? Come on, woman, I asked you to dance, whined Foster as they closed the apartment door. When George returned from his nerve-wracking shift, a thick envelope lay on the kitchen table along with the rest of the mail. A tropical cyclone threatened to turn into a hurricane, and George, as the officer on duty, kept a constant eye on the weather. He slept little and worried every day about whether he would have to evacuate the platform. He was grateful that he had transferred to the ship and left all the worries and stress to Greg Buckhammer, the other duty officer. Of course, George smiled, looking at the Weather Channel app on his phone, which showed the depression subsiding and gaining strength that morning. However, the official divorce papers did little to lift his spirits. George grimly read the legal article and wondered for a moment how Samantha felt when she received a copy of the court decision. George poured himself a few sips of Iron Barrel chocolate whiskey into a small glass and drank grimly to his failed marriage. George wasn't home when William, grumbling and complaining, drove Samantha to St. Elizabeth's Trauma Center. 11 hours later, when only Dr. Pyler and a nurse had been helping in the delivery room for the last 2 hours and William had gone to the cafeteria, Samantha gave birth to Cynthia Barbara Laquette. William was outraged that the baby would have the last name of that son of a bitch instead of his own. We're not married, why should I name her Carter? Samantha asked wearily. But isn't she beautiful? Yeah, William agreed, not even looking at the crumpled, bruised creature in Samantha's arms. Cynthia had all her fingers and toes, brown eyes, and fiery red hair. Weighing 6 pounds, 4 ounces, and measuring 19 inches, she was the perfect size and weight for a full-term baby. George nodded with satisfaction at the news of his daughter's birth. His mother's name was Barbara, and he wondered if good old William knew that. Samantha's mother's name was Cynthia, but so was George's beautiful, sweet, and loving sister. George wondered if Samantha remembered that when she named her daughter Cynthia. George wondered if Samantha remembered how happy Cindy was to finally have an older sister. George wondered if Samantha remembered taking Cindy to the zoo in Lafayette and to Bolorama. George wondered if Samantha remembered holding Cindy's hand when a congenital heart defect took their beloved little sister away. Once ashore, George immediately bought his daughter Raggy Andy and Raggy Ann dolls. Apparently, Samantha had a new phone number. He received a message saying that the number had been changed or was no longer in service. George didn't want to show up unannounced, so he called Polly Chastain's office. Polly promised to call Samantha. Samantha called George less than 3 minutes later. She agreed that now was a good time to stop by and see the baby. George flinched when he saw William's Mercedes-Benz in the open garage. The message was loud and clear. William had left the door open so George could see him and realized that he had been replaced by a more attractive, wealthy, and handsome man. William grinned from behind Samantha as she opened the front door to let George into the house. Samantha smiled happily as George handed the 2 dolls to the sleeping girl. He placed the dolls at the foot of the crib, then crouched down and simply gazed in admiration at the beautiful girl. He paid no attention to William's posture and smugness and focused all his attention on his daughter. Oh, I almost forgot, George said, and handed Samantha a small package. This is for you. What is it? William asked. When she opens it, you'll see, George said, and crouched down again to look at the beautiful girl. Oh, George, it's... Samantha gasped at the sight of a 5x7 silver photo frame with Cynthia's name and date of birth engraved at the bottom. "Oh, you put her baby picture in there," George said, and took a picture of Cynthia with his cell phone. "Hi, sweetie. It's me. Hi, it's Daddy." Excuse me? She's going to call me Daddy," William declared. "Maybe," George agreed easily, even though his blood was boiling. "I'm sure she'll come up with names for both of us." William joined the conversation again when George politely asked for Samantha's new phone number. When she called, only private appeared on the screen. George's statement that he only needed the number because of their daughter did not reassure William, who muttered that George didn't need Samantha's number. "Oh, okay," George said. "I can always call Polly, I guess." George was 3 blocks from home when his phone rang. He looked up and smiled. Samantha had sent him her phone number with the text, Cynthia. The night before her return to shore, Cynthia hadn't slept. And even better, William wasn't around. Sitting in his new rocking chair with his precious daughter in his arms, George cried happily. "I'm sorry, but you have to go," Samantha said gently but firmly. George nodded obediently and left the house. However, when he saw William's Mercedes-Benz around the corner, he laughed. He smiled broadly and waved to William as their cars passed each other. The tinted windows prevented George from seeing, but he was sure William did not respond to his friendly greeting. Trevor had to intervene when Samantha objected to George inviting his daughter to his apartment. Samantha panicked when she realized that Cynthia would not be at home in her own bed anytime soon. She insisted on coming over to check out the apartment to make sure her child would be safe. Hi, I'm your Aunt Denise." "Hi," Denise Chalmers stammered as George carried the baby from the car to the front door. "George? Who's that?" Samantha asked, concerned that a short, heavy-set woman was talking excitedly about her daughter. "Hey, Willie, do you believe the Saints picked James Winston? I know Briss retired, but what about Taysom Hill, huh?" asked Foster as William, following Samantha, looked around at everyone and everything. "Me what? Dude, it's William, okay?" "Not Willie," William corrected himself. Samantha reluctantly approved of the cast-iron crib that matched the cast-iron double bed. She wasn't surprised to see that the bed was neatly made. She wasn't surprised that George had a small trash can that he put in the sparkling clean bathtub when it was time to bathe his daughter. She wasn't surprised to find baby soap, baby shampoo, and baby lotion there either. "And I told him to buy A&D ointment because it's the best for diaper rash," Denise said, showing Samantha the tube of ointment in George's first aid kit. "Do you use cloth or disposable diapers?" "Disposable," Samantha replied, still not understanding what Aunt Denise meant. Was all Denise said on the subject. Samantha discovered that William and Foster had bonded not over their shared love of the New Orleans Saints, but over the chocolate-flavored Iron Barrel whiskey that George loved. Samantha stoically reached for William's car keys. "What, my God? I only had two or three," William declared vehemently. "Foster," Denise said, letting her husband know she wasn't too happy that he had stolen alcohol from the neighbors. "Dude, we need to find out what this is." "An Iron Barrel? Oh, hey, chocolate?" Denise, you know that whiskey comes in different flavors," Foster said cheerfully and drunkenly as Denise led him out of the apartment. "The keys. Or I can take an Uber," Samantha demanded as William staggered to his feet from George's comfortable sofa. Samantha pulled William toward the car. Samantha made sure that Cynthia Barbara Lackett's christening was scheduled for Sunday, when George would be home. At the christening, Richard Chastain, Samantha's father, made it clear to George that he was very disappointed in his daughter's actions. Richard and George had always had a strained, tense relationship. Richard was convinced that his daughter was capable of more than marrying a rude man. Even after George was promoted to shift supervisor, her father was convinced she could find someone better. But now, despite William Carter's ownership of a third share of the Tri-Carter Oil Company, Richard wasn't sure his daughter had changed for the better. And seeing how George flinched when Cynthia cried when water was poured on her, while William just looked bored, Richard was sure his daughter hadn't changed. "It's not me," George said, trying to explain, as they had dinner at Samantha's house after the christening. "Yeah, I know it's all you. At least she was honest," Richard reluctantly agreed. "And that woman keeps calling herself Aunt Denise. Is she your friend?" "No, she's married to that idiot in the Saints jersey," George laughed, pointing to Foster, who was standing, eating hot meatballs and whistling because they were too hot. The party ended soon after. Foster and Denise left. The Saints were battling the Carolina Panthers, and Foster didn't want to miss the second half of the game. Some of Samantha's co-workers from the Mexican restaurant Casa Ole left when it became clear that the alcohol wasn't going to run out. "She'll call me Daddy," William teased George as he sat down and began rocking the baby. "Oh, I'm sure she'll come up with a name for you," George said, meeting William's gaze. "William," Samantha said, pressing her lips together. "What if she doesn't?" "I have a few suggestions," George said and grinned when Richard laughed. "George," Samantha said, pressing her lips together even tighter. "Bye, sweetie, bye," George whispered softly to the sleeping child. "Daddy misses you already." "Thank you," Samantha said quietly, as George placed his hand on the door handle of his daughter's room. "The cross and chain are very beautiful. I'm sure when she grows up, she'll wear them with pride." "I'm sure she will," George smiled. On Monday afternoon, George was leaving the laundry room of his house when he saw a little girl standing in front of Denise's door. The girl had thick brown hair that almost touched the sidewalk in front of the door, but she had pulled it back into a high ponytail. When she turned to see who was following her, George was struck by her clear green eyes. They usually come home around 5:30 or 6, George said. "Oh, okay," said the girl, turning completely around. George saw that it wasn't a girl, but a very short woman. "Hello, I'm George," George said, opening the door to his apartment. "George Luckett." "Oh, you, you, you're George? The one with the beautiful little girl," the girl chirped, and her pretty face lit up with a broad smile. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. And let me tell you, there's nothing more beautiful than my Cynthia," George agreed proudly, setting the laundry basket down by the door. George took out his phone and showed the girl the latest photos taken at Cynthia's christening. "Oh," the girl sighed. "Hi, I see you've already met Cha-Cha," said Foster. Charlene Charmer's face instantly changed from an adoring smile to a displeased grimace. She shifted her gaze from Foster's smiling face to George's slightly curious expression. "I see you've met my second favorite brother," Charlene said sharply. "How many brothers do you have?" "One," Charlene replied sharply. George took the laundry to his apartment and then crossed the threshold of the Charmers' apartment. Foster was making coffee. George couldn't understand how Foster and Denise could consume so much caffeine and still sleep. "Foster said you work at sea?" Charlene asked. "Yes, I'm leaving tomorrow for repairs," George replied. "Why did I do the laundry?" "I'm an administrative assistant," Charlene said proudly. "She works right here on this street," Foster said, clearly proud. "Where do you work?" asked George, thinking the girl looked too young to be an administrative assistant. "I work at Vickers and Dumas. They do investigations," replied Charlene. "Maybe they need to find the rest of them," suggested Foster. Suggested Foster. Suggested Foster. Suggested Foster. "Hey, George, did you notice? She's not even 5 feet tall. George, do you have any coffee in the next room?" "I'm not going to sit here until Denise gets back," said Charlene, jumping up from her chair in the kitchen. "I can make something quick," said George. "Hey, Foster, let's see if they can figure out why you're such a jerk, huh?" "Yeah," agreed Charlene, ushering George out of the apartment. "The coffee's almost ready," protested Foster. "When Denise comes, tell her your sister is in the next room," George said. In his apartment, George learned that Foster's sister's name was Charlene. Charlene Paula Charmers. Because her name was Charlene Charmers, her family gave her the nickname Cha-Cha, which she hated. Charlene was 19 years old and was studying to be an administrative assistant at St. Anne's Military Technical Institute. A Nicole King scholarship paid for her education, and now she planned to contribute 5% of her salary to the Nicole King scholarship until she paid off her debt. My cousin Michelle studied at the University of California, Los Angeles for 4 years and earned a degree in literature. Now she works at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Charlene said, taking a sip of her coffee. "I like your mug. Where is Viv Island? In the bay?" "Slow down," George suggested, pouring himself a cup of decaf coffee. "View Island," Charlene said. "Well, even though we just met, I love you too," George smiled. "The island. Oh, I see," said Charlene, laughing happily and melodiously. "My silly husband says you're here," said Denise, bursting into the apartment. "George, did you show her pictures of this beautiful baby?" "Of course," replied Charlene, jumping off the sofa and hugging her short sister-in-law. "Did Foster tell you that I work right there? Right on Vickers and Dumas? On Lopez Square? Right there?" Denise asked, pointing to an ugly, low building. "Yeah," Charlene replied proudly. George found himself being dragged back into the Charmers' apartment while Denise prepared dinner. George decided he would buy Charlene her own half-liter mug with "View of the Island" written on it. It was easy enough to find out that her favorite color was pink. Foster, Charlene, and Denise answered that question in unison. Somewhere between dinner and the moment George finally dragged himself out of the apartment, he promised himself that the next time he came home from work, he would take Charlene to Vermilion for a night of dancing. Aunt Denise immediately volunteered to babysit Cynthia Laquette. "Hey, look, is that my sister? My little sister. She's only 19, you hear?" Foster glared at George. "So, how old were we?" Denise shouted at her husband. "My God, could you be any more of an idiot?" Charlene snapped at her brother, blushing with embarrassment. "We're going dancing, we're going dancing. That's all. Is that clear?" Returning from a 14-day shift, George insisted on picking up Charlene from her parents' house. He insisted on going inside to meet Hank and Debbie Chalmers. Charlene watched in amazement as George and her overprotective father told tall tales about the recent deer hunting season. They promised they would try to get together for a hunt this season. "Are you sure?" "Ugh, Dad, I don't want to eat venison," Hank said, patting his daughter's plump bottom awkwardly. "Hank," Debbie smiled, shaking her head. "Dad," Charlene whined. The Zydeco Band was a good band with an annoying lead singer. The blind guitarist sang all the songs through his nose, giving everything a nasal sound that didn't really suit either the music or his voice. But the band itself played cheerful music that was easy to tap your feet to. "When are you going to pick up Cynthia?" asked Charlene as George walked her to the front door. "What were you two talking about in the car for the last 10 minutes?" asked Hank, opening the door as Charlene stepped onto the porch. Charlene gasped. George noticed the mischievous gleam in Hank's eyes when Charlene screamed. George grinned. "And we were wondering how long it would take you to come over here and kick my ass," George agreed easily. "Good night, Charlene." "Good night, Hank." "What?" "It's Mr. Hank, young man," Hank said, dragging Charlene into the house. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hank," George smiled. "I plan to invite her to dinner tomorrow at Sweet Peas. Do you mind?" "What's on the menu?" Hank asked, smiling when he heard his daughter's bitter complaint to her mother. "What does it matter to you? You know it'll be delicious." George smiled and got into his pickup truck. The stuffed pork chops were excellent. Charlene surprised George by managing to finish her entire plate, but none of them had room for dessert. By this time, Samantha had not only gotten used to Denise's bossy nature, but also felt comfortable in her company. In a way, Samantha decided that she and Denise were friends. So she smiled when Denise asked to see the new photos of her baby. George wasn't surprised to see two women and a child at his doorstep when Samantha and Cynthia pulled up to his apartment. William decided to stay in the car. Apart from drinking, William and Foster had nothing in common, and Samantha had made a rule. William was not allowed to drink in George's apartment. He nodded politely when George's strange neighbor waved at him in greeting. "I'm fine, well, you know?" "Yes, I know you'll be fine," Samantha muttered, kissing Cynthia one more time. "If you need anything, just call, okay? Bye, sweetie. Bye, Cynthia. Mommy misses you already. Bye." Less than 5 minutes later, William and Samantha drove out of the parking lot, and Charlene was already banging on George's door. "Hi, is she here?" "The baby's here," Charlene demanded, bursting into the apartment. George put on some decaf coffee while Charlene squealed and fussily fussed over the baby. Then he placed his green Isle of View mug and her new pink Isle of View mug on the table. "Can I hold her?" asked Charlene, already holding Cynthia in her arms as she carried the baby into the living dining room. "Are you going to say no?" George smiled. "No," said Charlene, sitting down on the comfortable sofa. "Hi, Cindy. Hi, sweetie. Hi." George felt tears welling up in his eyes as Charlene quietly sang a few Cajun songs to the baby. His mother had often sung these songs to him, and he remembered her singing them to his sister Cindy. Even when his sister turned 15, Cindy insisted that their mother sing her these songs. "Cindy would have loved you," George thought, looking at the beautiful 19-year-old girl holding the baby in her arms. "Oh, you're psychic," said Charlene, sipping her coffee from a mug. "I love you too. I'll go heat up the stew. Will you stay?" George asked. "What?" No, my mom is making stuffed peppers on the stove. She got the recipe from the show, The Cast Iron Skillet. "Have you ever seen it?" Charlene asked. "Milt DuPont?" "Yeah. I liked how he cooked with alligator and rat from the kids' show," George agreed. "Oh, I know. I laughed when he was going to hit alligator with the skillet, Charlene giggled. After kissing him, Charlene left his apartment. George had dinner, then bathed his daughter and fed her from a bottle. He tried to remember the words to lullabies, but most of the songs he had to hum while holding the baby. The management company had left a notice in the mailbox. George had 1 month left on his lease. If he signed a 1-year lease, his rent would be reduced by $100 for the first month. If he signed a 6-month lease, his rent would be reduced by $50 for the first month. But if he decided to rent the apartment on a month-to-month basis, the rent would go up by $25 a month. At least you did one good thing, Denise, George thought as he called Tammy Hale. So, what are you looking for? Tammy asked pleasantly. Denise said you have a baby. Congratulations. While he was talking to Tammy, George went to the Davis Realty website and saw a 1-story house 3 blocks from his former residence. He gave Tammy the address and MLS number. Oh, is that the one? Yes, sir. It's listed below market value, Tammy agreed. I can give you a ride and… Tammy, don't you have a car seat in your car? I'll drive myself, George insisted. Denise insisted, and Foster grumbled as he tore himself away from ESPN Sports. Look, he has a nice fenced-in yard where you could put a swing set, Denise declared. There's already a basketball hoop, Foster said, spotting the old backboard and rim above the garage. All you need is a net. Yeah, he'll get rid of that ugly thing, Denise insisted. Right? George smiled. Yes. What, you think Cynthia's going to be a basketball player? Denise asked. So here, this is where we'll put her crib, right in this room. The next evening, Charlene went to look at the house. It was a 15-minute walk from her parents' house. It would be faster by bike and even faster by car. Does it have a gas stove? Charlene asked excitedly. Tammy, let's start filling out the paperwork, George said. The application was approved. First National Bank of DeHardy gave George a mortgage, and Foster watched as George's furniture was loaded onto the short moves truck as it pulled up to the apartment complex. Denise watched as George's furniture and boxes were unloaded at his new home. The 3 muscular men were professionals. They knew enough to politely agree with everything the little woman said. Thanks, ma'am, said the foreman, as Denise handed each of them a crumpled 20 and an even more crumpled 5. Men, you better believe the woman she married. I mean, they put their foot down, said one of the men, quickly moving on to the next step. My mom, she could spank you with a wooden spoon and then cook dinner with the same spoon 5 minutes later, agreed the foreman. Those African Americans? Don't mess with them. Samantha arrived and brought Cynthia and William to George's new home. George was polite to both Samantha and William. In fact, he didn't want that arrogant, smirking man in his house. But George was matured enough to know that rudeness and unwelcoming behavior would get him nowhere. Wow, you can walk around here, Samantha commented. Yes, you'll probably see us walking around outside, George said, showing Samantha the new stroller he had bought. Yes, is there a pool? William smiled, peering into the backyard through the patio doors. William, Samantha said cautiously. What the hell? Can't I say anything without you getting angry? William retorted. Hey, whose Mercedes is that? Mine, William smiled. George, is that? Samantha asked. Samantha, this is Charlene Chalmers, George said. She's my girlfriend. George didn't know why it was so hard for him to admit that this beautiful girl was his girlfriend. George assumed that part of his hesitation was because he was having a hard time accepting the fact that Samantha was his ex-wife and not his wife. Charlene, this is Samantha, George said. She's Cynthia's mom. Oh, Charlene said, standing next to George. Very nice to meet you. Charlene took George's hand, indicating that he would have to explain or try to explain the slight hesitation in his voice when he introduced her as his girlfriend. Samantha agreed. In Cynthia's nursery, George set up the changing table and the new low dresser. Samantha wasn't surprised to see that the changing table matched Cynthia's crib. She also wasn't surprised to see a charming lamp on it with a little ballerina raising her arms and holding a lampshade. It was one of the things that had annoyed Samantha so much about her husband, her ex-husband. Everything was neat, tidy, and in its place. Their finances were the same, neat, tidy, and organized. They had money and could have gone to Hawaii. But George insisted they wait. We had so much more money to do, so many more things, Samantha muttered as she saw a toy box in the closet with several new toys waiting for Cynthia to play with them. Let's go, Samantha demanded suddenly, grabbing William's hand. Samantha almost smiled. She could read the expression on Charlene's face. William, proud as he was, caught Samantha's hint when she grabbed his hand. George understood everything. Charlene, with tears in her eyes, was asking him if he was ashamed of her. If he was ashamed of her. Or maybe he still couldn't forget his ex-wife. George hugged and kissed Charlene, lifting her easily into his arms. Gently and calmly, he explained to her the difficulties he faced when his ex-wife and his love were in the same room at the same time. "Am I your love?" asked Charlene, melting into his embrace. While George and Charlene were making up, hugging on his couch, William was in Samantha's living room. "I'm leaving," Samantha said, hurrying across the living room and heading for the garage. "I don't know when I'll be back. You'll be having dinner alone, understand?" "Oh, okay," William said, getting up from the couch. "I love you." William didn't notice that Samantha didn't respond to his affectionate remark. He walked over to this bar in the corner and poured himself a few sips of St. Elizabeth Premium whiskey. After checking the weight of the bottle, William poured a few more sips into his glass. "We need to meet," Samantha texted her cousin Polly while William drove the 3 blocks from George's new house to their home. Polly's reply didn't make Samantha very happy. Polly and her wife were at Casual, a small place that the two women had decided to make their home. Samantha would have preferred complete solitude in Polly's office, or even better, in her beautiful and cozy home, just without Whitney. Samantha didn't dislike the pretty blonde, but it was damn hard not to love the modest, sweet, and affectionate Whitney. Without Whitney, Samantha could ignore Polly's lifestyle and pretend it didn't exist. "Hey, Terry, another diet drink for me, and then pour me a shot of oak leaf, okay?" Polly exclaimed cheerfully as Samantha entered the cozy, quiet bar. "Hooray!" Whitney giggled happily, leaning against Polly. "Joe Bob, Carla's on her way, you hear?" Terry, an elderly man, said to a heavily intoxicated patron. "Oh shit, that's great. She'll see me like this," Joe Bob muttered, resting his head on the bar. "Slow down," Whitney warned when Terry placed a glass of amber liquid in front of Samantha. "Oh, damn, that's good," Samantha exclaimed, sipping the smooth whiskey. "So how's it going?" Polly asked, seating Samantha and Whitney at a corner table. Samantha started, stopped, took another sip of whiskey, and shook her head. Polly gently placed her hand on Whitney's thigh, seeing that she was about to come to Samantha's aid. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a beautiful but exhausted blonde. They couldn't hear what the woman was saying to the drunk man, but they could hear the desperation in her voice. "Yes, yes, damn it, come on," Joe Bob growled, slumping down on a stool. Taking another breath, Samantha looked at the dark paneled wall and began to speak. She quietly told the two women that she felt suffocated, trapped in her marriage to George Luckett. She wanted to live, she wanted to have fun. But George couldn't or wouldn't be spontaneous and fun. "He even makes the bed before he leaves the room," Samantha muttered. "He swears he can't leave the bedroom until—" Whitney giggled, and Polly playfully slapped her hand. Samantha ignored the two women's quarrel and continued to complaining that George thought everything through, planned everything, and prepared everything. Then she told him about her meeting with William when he came over on Friday for a margarita. Being an attractive red-haired girl, Samantha was used to men, and sometimes women, approaching her. Most of them backed off when Samantha showed them her very beautiful engagement ring and matching wedding band. "George saved every penny," Samantha said quietly, looking at her bare finger. "He even started painting the house during the weeks he was on vacation." "Oh," Whitney couldn't help but let out an enthusiastic sigh. "Yes," Samantha agreed quietly and tried to take another sip of the excellent whiskey from her empty glass. That Friday morning, Samantha told George that she had seen a brand new Lexus in the driveway the other day. She didn't say she wanted one, she just mentioned that she had seen it and really liked it. George immediately rejected the idea of buying her a new car of any make or model. "Depreciation starts the moment the wheels touch the ground," Samantha repeated in George's deep voice. That day, Samantha drove to work in a bad mood. When the handsome and talkative William Carter got into her compartment, Samantha noticed his expensive suit, large diamond ring, and Rolex watch. Leaving a signed check with a 100% tip, William also left his business card. "It's not the first time someone has left a business card," Samantha muttered. But it was the first time Samantha hadn't thrown away a business card. In the upper right corner was the Tri-Carter logo, and right in the center of the card was William Carter, President of Sales. On the back, William wrote his cell phone number. At first, the illicit affair was exciting, thrilling, spontaneous, and fun. Then George showed up. For a whole week, I had to be a good, obedient wife doing everything I was told, saving money on everything until Lincoln started howling, Samantha mused. And now? Polly asked after a long pause. And now? Samantha asked thoughtfully, looking at the table. Indeed, they didn't spare a penny. If Samantha wanted cinnamon rolls, she could buy them at Pillsbury's instead of Burns& and Burns grocers. For beef stroganoff, she could buy beef instead of the stewed meat George always insisted on. She and William went to the movies at the regular time when most people went, not to the morning matinees for $1 off. William would go to the concession stand and buy a huge bag of buttered popcorn. After that, they would go to the Yum Yum ice cream parlor so that everyone could buy a cone. George always gave them one or the other. They could buy a large bag of buttered popcorn and a drink, or go to the ice cream parlor afterwards. Okay, so George is a cheapskate, Polly said. No, he's not a cheapskate. He's not a miser, Samantha defended George. He's just incredibly practical. William wasn't practical. William had never thought about saving money for a rainy day. He had had a gold umbrella his whole life. Everything in her house, the house she shared with William, every piece of furniture, every glass, every plate, had been bought by George. Samantha tried, but couldn't name a single thing in the house that William had bought. Soap, Samantha said aloud. I buy A&A soap. I like raw milk and honey soap, Whitney said enthusiastically. It stinks, Polly teased. I'll take blackberry, Samantha suggested absently. Another one, Polly asked quietly when Samantha picked up the empty glass again. Yes, Whitney. You can have another one too, Polly laughed, and Whitney hurried to the bar. You're not drinking, Samantha remarked as Whitney placed 2 cups on the table. It's bad for the baby, Polly smiled, and Whitney squealed happily again. Samantha was shocked when Whitney's hand landed on Polly's flat stomach. Polly placed her hand on Whitney's, pressing it against their child. Samantha took a sip of whiskey and tried to smile at her cousin and her wife. They were obviously both thrilled about the pregnancy. William walked around the house looking pleased, like a proud rooster in a henhouse. Until the results of George's damn DNA test came back, showing that William wasn't the father of the child, but George. I hope it's a girl. She'll play with Cynthia, Samantha said, and Whitney giggled and Polly beamed. So, Samantha, what are you thinking about? Polly asked after a few minutes of silence. Samantha was thinking about the awkward and uncomfortable Sunday lunch at Minnie Carter's house the previous Sunday. The lunch itself had been very good. It had been prepared by Minnie's maid, a very proper Englishwoman. Minnie was polite but cold to Samantha, and didn't even look at Cynthia. William's sister Natalie had a naughty 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Carter. Natalie was on fairly good terms with Samantha. Andrew, William's younger brother, brought his wife, 5-year-old daughter Rihanna, and 1-year-old son Andrew Jr. to dinner. Andrew was a red-haired man with a harsh, cold gaze. His wife Victoria looked strange with her facial piercings and tattoos. Andrew called her Rhea, and Samantha made a fool of herself by calling the ugly blonde Rhea. Samantha, darling, we're not lovers, Victoria said sternly, so don't call me Rhea, okay? I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Samantha stammered. That was the end of the conversation. The old servant responded to Samantha's compliment about his cooking skills with a stony nod. Samantha thanked Minnie for inviting her to dinner at her beautiful home, and Minnie simply nodded with a forced smile on her face. From the moment she entered Miss Barbara's house, George's mother dragged Samantha into the kitchen. Naturally, Cindy wanted to follow her, and the 3 women set about preparing Sunday dinner while George and his father sat watching a boring soccer game on TV. Come here, Cindy ordered when George peeked into the kitchen. It's just us girls. No boys allowed. Yes, Samantha giggled, eliciting a radiant smile from Cindy. Samantha remembered that this was how every Sunday was. The warmth of the Lackett kitchen, the smells, the laughter. Cindy constantly seeking approval from Miss Barbara and Samantha. Samantha had no doubt that the next Sunday lunch at Miss Carter's house would be just as tense and uncomfortable, and the next one would be the same, just as awkward and uncomfortable. William didn't notice any of this. He was genuinely surprised when Samantha mentioned her discomfort. I think I feel guilty about buying it, Samantha confessed to her cousin, looking away from the dark wood of the table. And? Polly asked. And nothing, absolutely nothing, Samantha said, finishing her drink. Back at her apartment, Samantha heated up her lean cuisine meal. Later, she entertained William for a while. William approached George and asked if he could watch Cynthia for 2 weeks while he took Samantha on a cruise. George made arrangements with Bowman, but not for William and Samantha, but for his daughter. When they boarded the ship, Samantha was almost in a panic. Before, when their daughter was with George, she was only a few steps away from him. But here, on a cruise ship, she was hundreds of miles away from them. If the baby needed her, Samantha wouldn't be able to get to Cynthia. Damn it! Damn it, can you hear me? Can you hear me? William exclaimed, stretching out on the bed in their cabin. What? Samantha asked, looking around. Yes. No screams or crying children. William smiled. At that moment, Samantha hated William Carter with all her heart. Her child, her precious little girl, was not a nuisance. Her daughter was not a nuisance. She did not cause any inconvenience. So, on the other side of the iceberg, William knelt down on one knee, holding out a ring with a 4-carat square-cut diamond. To Samantha, it was one of the ugliest rings she had ever seen. It was simply tasteless. Although Samantha was sure it cost a pretty penny, it looked cheap and tacky. No, Samantha replied quietly but firmly. What? Are you kidding? William whispered, genuinely shocked. Don't make this worse, Samantha sighed and turned to join the group. The return trip was spent in silence. For Samantha, the return trip was more pleasant. William didn't bother her with questions, and she was much closer to her little daughter. As soon as the door opened, William began gathering his things. Samantha grabbed her car keys and went to rescue her daughter and take her home. Hey, she's almost asleep, whispered a tired George, letting Samantha into the house. Samantha stood and listened as Charlene hummed softly along with Cynthia. Samantha remembered how Miss Barbara used to sing these songs to Cynthia. Samantha's eyes filled with tears when she heard the familiar lullaby. Yes, Mommy, it looks like we've had colic this week, George admitted, as Charlene carried the sleeping baby out of the room. Colic? Oh no, Samantha exclaimed, feeling terribly guilty that her baby was feeling unwell and she hadn't come to help her. Hi, Samantha, smiled a tired Charlene as she entered the kitchen. How are you? How did it go? I've never been to Alaska, you know? I hated it, Samantha admitted. I'm drinking your last beer, Charlene informed George. Really? Even though I already put 6 more cans in there? George asked. I see you're still drinking 1 can at a time, Samantha smiled gently. Yeah. Hey, there's plenty of room in the pantry, George justified himself. Samantha, do you need anything? How cold is that beer? Samantha asked. It should be cold by now, George replied. Okay, I'll come by tomorrow. When are you going ashore? Samantha asked, looking at Cynthia. Tuesday, George replied. Then I'll be back in 4 weeks. I switched with Greg for this extra week. That's so like you, Samantha thought, almost angry at George's practicality. No, you can't use a single day of your vacation. No, you have to think everything through so that everything is better, damn it. Just damn it. When Samantha returned, the house looked like a tornado had passed through it. William hadn't broken anything, but he hadn't bothered to put anything back in its place. The dresser drawers were ajar. Clothes hangers were scattered on the floor and on the bed. Sighing, Samantha put everything back in its place and then vacuumed the entire house. She grinned. She was doing exactly what George would have done. Alimony from Cynthia always arrived 3 days before the due date. Because of her infidelity, Samantha didn't receive alimony from her husband. Besides, Samantha didn't need alimony. She had William and William's credit card to fall back on. 2 months after William left, Samantha realized she was in trouble. Her meager savings were running out. She was faced with a choice: pay the mortgage or pay the utilities and buy food. But she couldn't afford either. Most of her child support went to Happy Land, the daycare she sent her daughter to when she went to work during the 2 weeks George was away. Dad, I need help, Samantha said. You need help? You need help? That damn insulin went up 3 times in a month. And the damn insurance company is trying to tell me that the tree that fell on the house wasn't caused by the damn hurricane. It wasn't a hurricane. Then what was it? I didn't push it onto the house, her father muttered into his cell phone. Need some help? Join the club. George smiled happily as Samantha led their daughter into the house. A few minutes later, Denise and Charlene arrived. Samantha burst into tears, and George was sent to the nursery to look after his daughter while his friend and girlfriend comforted his ex-wife. Women, huh, Cynthia? George said. Oh, wait, you're one of them too, aren't you? Yes, I'm with you. But promise me you'll always love me no matter what happens, okay? I promise, said Charlene, standing in the doorway. George, you have to come stay with us. With tears in her eyes, Samantha confessed that waitressing wasn't for her. The days were long and the pay was terrible. She needed all the tips she could get, and tips weren't steady. So what do you want from me? George asked. Yes, ma'am, I'm still working. Ma'am, what if it weren't for Nicole King's scholarship? I don't know where I'd be, Charlene muttered into her cell phone. I, George, I don't know, Samantha admitted, avoiding her ex-husband's gaze. Oh, you need to talk to that woman, you hear me? Said Charlene, placing the cell phone in Samantha's hand. Hello? Charlene, who is this? Samantha asked. Hello, this is Kampala Jeffries. I'm the current chair of the Nicole King Scholarship Committee. Miss Charmer said you're the perfect candidate to help us. As you may know, all recommendations from previous scholarship recipients are moved to the top of the list, said the pleasant voice reassuringly. How about 3 o'clock? 3 when? What day? Samantha asked. Today at 3 o'clock, Miss Lassette, Kampala laughed. Now go home and put on something nice. No, I'll go with you, Charlene said. Oh, you see, by God's will, I have half the day off today. While Samantha was getting ready and putting on her nice clothes, Charlene taught her what to say. Finally, Charlene decided that the outfit was good enough and Samantha's makeup was fine. Hello, Mrs. Jakes. Are we at Kampala yet? Are you Miss Laquette? Sheila Jakes smiled. I'll tell Mrs. Jeffries you're here. Charlene, how are you? She'll see you now, Sheila said to Samantha after a moment. This is... I'll take her. I know where it is, said Charlene, taking Samantha by the hand and pulling her down the hallway. Charlene, hello. The attractive African-American woman smiled as she stood up. Are you pregnant? Charlene gasped, noticing the woman's small belly. An hour later, George looked up and saw a beaming Charlene entering his house. He stood up and started making dinner. She's going to study at WOTEC, that's what. She thinks she can become an administrative assistant like me, Charlene announced cheerfully. Should I be worried? Are you talking to my ex-wife? George teased. Hey, we're both Cynthia's moms, Charlene defended herself. We have to get along for the sake of the child. George froze when Samantha burst into the house and called for Charlene. Charlene left George in the kitchen. Samantha handed her a brochure for the military technical school at St. Elizabeth's Parish and excitedly showed Charlene that one of the courses was childcare. They settled down on George's couch and began reading the other options. And I barged into your house like that? You probably would have shot me with a shotgun, George thought as he prepared the potato pancakes that Charlene loved so much. Is that enough for you? Charlene asked. And George smiled. Yes, that's enough, George replied. I'm sorry, Samantha said as they sat down at the table. I know that if you had broken into my house, I would have been very upset. But I was so happy when I saw the kindergarten and... We have a doorbell, George said calmly. I'll use it next time, Samantha promised. How do you always manage to do everything so perfectly? Potatoes? He's adding cream, Samantha replied. Cynthia cried out and George waved his hand to signal the two women to return to their seats. So when are you starting? George asked. Oh, not this Monday, next Monday, Samantha replied. I have to let them know by Friday so they can make sure there's room. I'm sure you'll be fine, said George, clearing the plates from the table. Yeah, I hope so, said Samantha, losing some of her enthusiasm. You remember, right? I studied at the University of California, Los Angeles for 1 semester. I got 3 B's and 1 C. Yes, and what did your father say? That you were playing too much and not studying enough, George agreed. Does anyone want diapers, huh? Does anyone want dry diapers? Charlene bustled about, taking Cynthia from Samantha's arms. George was standing at the sink when he felt his ex-wife's arms wrap around his waist. He felt her hug him from behind and rest her head on his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Samantha whispered. It's okay. Just ring the doorbell next time, okay? George said. No, not for that, Samantha said quietly, letting go of him. George turned slightly to look at her over his shoulder. For everything, Samantha whispered, turning and running out of George's house. George squeezed the sponge and placed it on a small wire rack behind the sink. He heard Samantha's car drive away. George heard Charlene singing to Cynthia as she carried the girl from the nursery to the living room. Yes, I'm sorry too, George said, and I don't regret it. When George entered the living room, Charlene looked up from the sofa. The warm, happy smile she gave George made him smile back. The next day, Hank and George met at Dead End to eat meatloaf with red or brown sauce. A very pretty blonde with strawberry-colored hair was jumping and writhing to some hip-hop tune, and Hank and George agreed that music wasn't the same since Chet Atkins had died. And you know, that girl doesn't even know who Chet Atkins is. Hank nodded. Probably not, George agreed. After Hank happily and joyfully gave George his blessing to marry his daughter, he generously paid the bill for lunch. Hank shrugged when George reluctantly informed him that he couldn't get married in a Catholic church because he was divorced. Hell, that doesn't matter. We're Lutherans. Larry Elgin, the Lutheran Redeemer, he'll marry you, Hank said cheerfully. As the two men left the bar, Hank was already calling Debbie to tell her the good news. Hank and George warned Debbie not to tell anyone about the happy event. Charlene didn't know about the ring in George's pocket. No, Samantha, I don't regret it, George thought as he stopped in front of his old house to pick up Cynthia. Hi, I was just about to call you, Samantha replied gloomily, already dressed in her Casa Ole waitress uniform. Billy just called. Monique just got up, quit her job, and left. Okay, George agreed, wrinkling his nose as he looked at the shabbiness of his former home. It needed a good dusting and vacuuming. The kitchen table hadn't been cleared since breakfast. George saw the frying pan Samantha had used to cook bacon and scrambled eggs. Yes, George, I know. The house is a mess, Samantha grumbled as George showed Cynthia to the door. But you know what? You don't live here. I live here. You don't live here anymore, George. No, Samantha. I don't regret it at all. George smiled as he buckled Cynthia into her car seat. The end. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and wait for the next video.